it's a good time to be into hedgerows at the moment because they've got a higher profile now than they've had for many a decade. Certainly during the 3 decades or so that I've been closely involved with them. I think that's for 2 main reasons. And that is that it's increasing recognition of the way that they can absolutely help us deal with both biodiversity crises and with the climate crisis. Sorry, a bit distracted there for a moment. So today I'm going to talk about why hedgerows are just so useful to us. I'm going to start off a lot about biodiversity and then move on to talk about all the other different ways in which hedges are of great benefit to us, and indeed why people should take notice of them as they are at the moment. But thank you very much for the first slide here, Rihanna. I thought I would start by looking backwards to see why hedgerows were created. And there are really 3 main reasons here. Ownership boundaries, stock booth barriers to keep livestock in or out of fields, and they used to be highly valued as sources of firewood. But now really those 3 values are pretty redundant because, you know, we've got very good maps, we've got satellite, we've got GPSs. And let's face it, if you want to get a good stock-proof barrier these days, you don't go to all the trouble of planting and then maintaining a hedge. You put up a wire fence, which does the job a lot easier. And again, as far as firewood goes, well, we still have very good alternative sources of heating. I say good, they're obviously not that green, but they're cheap. That's the point I'd make. So I'm going to come back to firewood later on in this presentation because I hope it's something that we will go back to thinking about hedges for. They can be very useful in producing firewood, but I'm going to come back to that. So to say, the past uses, the reason why hedges are established, largely redundant. Next slide, please. But what I'm going to focus on in this talk is the current and future uses. So I'm going to start off by talking quite a lot about wildlife, including about pollinators, and then going to consider the main ways in which hedges are of benefit to farmers and wider society. And there's a list there: pest and disease reduction, flood management, soil conservation, reducing water pollution, carbon and wood fuel, and then shelter and shade. And there'll be 1 or 2 other things as well. So let's press on. Next slide, please. Biodiversity. I mean, where would we be in our intensively farmed landscape without hedges? The answer is we'd have far less wildlife than we do at the moment. Loads of research showing just how important hedges are in intensive arable and grassland landscapes as refuges for nature. And indeed, you know, the value of hedges in those landscapes is far greater than the area of land they occupy. So in a well-hedged farm, perhaps 5% of it might be under those hedges. But you can be pretty sure that 95% or more of the wildlife will be associated with hedges or other similar linear features in the landscape. So hugely important. Next slide, please. I was challenged on a car journey by John Stokes. Some of you may know him, who works for the Tree Council, back in 2010. And he said to me, well, Rob, why don't you find out just how many different species of animal and plant and fungi you can find in a single hedge on your farm? So on New Year's Day, 2011, I started looking. And well, you can see in the slide here, the hedge I was looking at. It's a bog standard Devon hedge, so a good hedge, but nothing particularly exceptional about it. And I spent 2 years looking in detail at that hedge and had a lot of help from experts of identifying what I found there. So next slide. And this is the ways in which I sampled the hedge. So the tent-like structure you see alongside the hedge there, this is the other side of the hedge, is a Malaise trap. Malaise being a Swedish scientist who invented what is an extremely effective trap for catching flying insects. I mean, that just got masses of stuff I would never have found otherwise. The white domes on the verge and in the ditch are emergence traps. And I would say at this point that we should think of a hedgerow as much more than just a line of trees and shrubs. It should have mature standard trees in it, but it also, critically, should have a good tussocky grass or flower-rich margin, and maybe a ditch and a bank as well. So we need to think holistically about hedges. Too often we just think of them as just a line of trees and shrubs, but a good hedge is more than that. And I think I'll return to that later on in this talk. How else do I sample? I used light traps to catch moths, etc. Bits of tin to find reptiles, dormouse tubes, anything you can think of. And so the next slide shows you the number of species I found, and it's pretty staggering. I recorded from this one hedge in Devon, and so say not a special hedge, and you will have many similar hedges in Oxfordshire. These are species rich in terms of shrubs and trees, but I know you've got hedges like that in your county. And I found this 2,070 species. It's pretty staggering, but that's not the sum of it, because there's lots of stuff, in particular, small parasitic wasps. There are 7,000 species of parasitic wasp in this country, but unfortunately very few people who can identify them. And the few people who can have, and I understand this entirely, but they've got better things to do than look at my samples. But one day, those tubes full of alcohol and little wasps that are collecting dust in the Natural History Museum in London, one day somebody will put a DNA probe into them and we'll find out how many species there are, but there are hundreds more. If we look at the pie chart there, you'll see that the big purple segment is insects. That's as you would expect. Altogether, there are, 24,000 species of insect in this country, which is far more than for any other class of organism. And so it's not surprising, recorded, that huge number of species within the insects. What else do we pick out there? In terms of higher plants and bryophytes, 124. In terms of fungi and lichens, there were 79. But in terms of vertebrates, I recorded 50, which is about what you'd expect. That's birds and mammals and reptiles and amphibians. But the action is all in small stuff, which we tend to ignore because we are so big. When we walk along a hedge, we tend to see the odd rabbit, don't we, and a few birds flying up, as well as the trees and the shrubs. But really, most of the other stuff is there, but it needs to be looked for. I would make the point here that all those 2,000 species are things that are big enough to be seen with the native eye. So, they're not microscopic things. Next slide. For those of you who are interested in insects, this is a breakdown of the different orders of insect I found. The big orange segment is flies, Diptera. That's partly because I'm very interested in flies and knew a lot of people who helped me identify them. But partly, of course, as well as that, because there are an awful lot of flies. Just as with the parasitic Hymenoptera, the wasps, there's about 7,000 species in this country. So 830 represents 17% of all the flies on the British list. I also found 17% of all the moths and butterflies. That's that pale blue southeastern quadrant with 444 by it. As I say, the purple segment of bees and wasps is a considerable underestimate. As true, too, I think, is the green segment, is number of beetles. Only 119 found. there are 4,000 species of beetle in this country, so it almost certainly should have been a higher figure than that. But I have to admit that I wasn't really very good at finding beetles. So I'll leave that job for somebody else to do. And 17% of the caddisflies I got, and a fair smattering of bugs, etc. The next slide. So the question I would then, put to you is, if I found that many species in a single hedge, what might a whole network of hedgerows contain? Of course, many more. We don't know. Nobody's actually done that work. But it just reinforces the idea that these hedgerows are huge reservoirs of species in our farmed landscapes. The next slide. Now, you might legitimately ask me, well, so what? You found all these species in the hedgerow, but are they actually benefiting from the hedgerow? I mean, you could conceive that the hedgerow is nothing more than a big drift net spread across the landscape, catching insects and other things and reducing their survival chances. To explore that, I observed as much as I could the behavior of different animals in the hedge, and I looked at all the written research evidence, and I came to the conclusion that 99% at least of all those 2,000 species are actually benefiting directly from the hedge for one or more reasons. It could be for larval development, sources of adult food. We see a red admiral here nectaring on a bramble flower. It could be for finding mates. It could be, and importantly so, for shelter, or simply as movement corridors, safe conduits to the countryside where you can avoid the harshness of the weather and predators. Of all the times I was watching wildlife in the 2 years around this hedge, I saw a large white butterfly once approaching the hedge from across the adjacent field, perpendicular to it, and that butterfly flew along, hit the hedge, rose up over it, and continued in a straight line. But that was really very exceptional. When you come to a hedge and you look at things, they're either clearly doing something within the hedge or they're moving along it. Next slide, please. So within those 2,000 species and all the species being found in hedges, there are, of course, many, many ones that are either nationally rare or nationally scarce or are threatened. They're red listed. And indeed, there are 107 species that are considered to be priorities for conservation action. So those of you familiar with the technology, they're Section 41 species, or UK Biodiversity Action Plan species. And I've picked out a few here. So the turtle dove is one, closely associated with thorn bushes, mature blackthorn and hawthorn bushes, as safe places from which to sing, but also within which to nest. And what are hedges? They're lines of scrub, aren't they? Next slide. And here we have a hair-streak butterfly. This is a brown hair-streak, a beautiful but very elusive butterfly. It's vulnerable to extinction throughout the country. But I know that in Oxfordshire, as down here in Devon, you still have decent populations of it, which is fantastic. Now, this is a species that is associated, again, with scrub and with woodland edge. As I say, that's what hedges really are. They're lines of scrub and they're woodland edges. This one, the brown hair streak, it lays its eggs only on the young shoots of blackthorn. And the reason why it is now so scarce over much of the country is that the practice of hard annual trimming destroys all the eggs. And so we lose the butterfly. Next one. But here's an even greater speciality for Oxfordshire. This moth is the pale shining brown, an endangered species. It's one which Oxford University have done work on, and they found that it is closely associated with hedgerow trees. Where this moth occurs, its populations are highest in those landscapes with hedgerow trees. Next slide. And just jumping ahead now, the next slide, which hasn't come up yet. There we are, thank you. Just thinking about amphibians and reptiles, great crested newts, when they're not in their breeding ponds, well, they can be found in the base of hedgerows, particularly if there's a damp ditch, say, alongside your hedgerow. Bare patches within hedgerows are often good basking sites for common lizards. And here I've just picked out a slowworm as a species that I found in my hedge, for example, underneath the tin I put beside it. Next slide. A few more birds here. The yellowhammer, red listed, associated closely with hedges because it nests in the hedges, and it also uses hedgerow trees as its songposts. And the next slide. And here we have the tree sparrow. Now, you are so lucky in Oxfordshire still to have some tree sparrows, whereas here in Devon, we've lost them altogether. Now, this is a species that is a hole nester, and it will breed in mature hedgerow trees with veteran features, with small rot holes or woodpecker holes, that sort of thing. But when they're feeding, and they feed out in the fields, usually fairly close to the field margin, if they're disturbed by a predator, say a bird of prey, then they immediately rise and go into the hedge for safety. So the hedges perform a useful function in that capacity. Next slide. And well, the hedgehog, I think the name says it all, doesn't it? And I hardly need to say anything more about this. But sadly, this is another declining species, another red listed species. And one where if we look at keep our hedges in good condition, we've got a chance of maintaining decent populations of it. Next slide. And here we have a bat. This is a case of pipistrelle, but nearly all of our 17 species of British bat are associated in one way or another with hedges. They either use the hedges as foraging grounds from which to find the insects on which they feed, as does the pipistrelle, or with some of the larger bats, they use them very much as safe flyways through the landscape or navigation aids. So greater horseshoe bats, for example, are critically dependent upon hedgerows to move between foraging grounds in the landscape, as well as places in which they can find the larger moths and beetles upon which they feed. And the next one, my favorite. This, of course, is a hazel dormouse. Absolutely beautiful creatures. I came across these in our hedges on our farm because I found their nests, and I wondered what on earth these nests were. And so I did actually initially, I used to prod these nests to see if there's anything in them. And dormice have this wonderfully endearing habit of then coming out of the nests and then posing for you to take a photograph of them, as this one did, before returning to the nest. I have to say I don't do that very often because it's not really very good practice, but they are such adorable creatures, and we have healthy populations. Often it's thought that they are a species of closed canopy, high forest woodland, but they're not really. I mean, they will occur there, but their best populations are in early to mid-successional woodland, including coppice, for example, and in scrub. And of course, come back to it. That's what a hedge is. It's a line of scrub, and you can have populations of dormice in hedges that are just as strong as in the best woodlands. So next slide. So I talked about the nests. And this is the time of the year, really, or maybe it's just a little bit late, but actually to find the nests in hedgerows. I would encourage you to have a look in those places in the county where dormice are known to occur. They're characteristic. It's a breeding nest about the size of a grapefruit. If it's a shelter nest, maybe the size of an orange or even a tangerine. They're spherical. They nearly always have leaves in the outer layer, no clear entrance holes, distinguishing from a bird nest, and in a dense place in a hedge. They become apparent at this time of the year because we start to use the leaves, and then they're much more obvious. These, of course, are summer nests or active season nests. During the winter, they hibernate, and they use nests that are on the ground at the base of the hedge or in the margin in some moist spot. They need it moist, so they're not seeking out a dry, hollow spot in a hazel stool as you might expect. So that's a quick run through of some of the species associated with hedgerows. I now want to look at pollination. So if I have the next slide, please. A lot of focus these days on pollinators, and quite rightly so, and how they're declined across much of our landscape. There is good research now show that in these intensively managed landscapes that we have over so much of lowland England, that hedges are more or less vital for healthy populations of pollinators like bees, but also hoverflies and various other insects. And if you're a farmer, they can be important in this context. So if you've got a crop like, say, forage beans or oilseed rape or even clover, that the research shows that pollination rates can be increased for up to 750 meters away from the hedge. That's research largely based on bumblebees. So significant in that effect. Next slide. Here we are. This is in Normandy, in an apple orchard in Normandy, where we had a HedgeLink meeting. And here we see Monsieur Lejean, who is proud as punch over his orchard, and who incidentally produced a very fine covert indeed. He's extolling the virtues of hedges and how important they were, because when bees and solitary bees, which are essential for pollinating his apple trees, when the apples are not in flower, where are these bees getting all their resources from? Well, the answer is they're getting from the hedge. In the spring, from the flowering shrubs, and in the summer, from the herbs that grow in the hedgerow margin. And again, thinking, where are these bees, where are they hibernating? Well, they're hibernating at the base of the hedge. Where do they have their summer breeding nests? Well, again, at the base of the hedge. So hedges and orchards really do go hand in hand in this respect. Next slide, please. I just want to come back here. Excuse me, I just want to come back here. Just at this point, that a good hedge is much more than just a line of shrubs and trees. And sorry for repeating myself here, but it's such an important point that we really do need to think, about these flower-rich and tussocky grass margins, as well as the standard trees, because it's those flowers in the base of the hedgerow and immediate margins that are so important for so much wildlife. If you've got a bank and a ditch as well, then even better. But moving on to the next slide, please. Just about summer flowers in the margins to make the point, a good variety of flowers is good. So those with a deep corolla tube, like the hapweed or the white clover we see here, they're good for butterflies and bees. Whereas the flatter flowers with shallow corolla tubes, like the umbels, the Apiaceae, are very good for beetles, like this longhorn beetle. We see a wasp beetle here, a type of longhorn beetle, but also for a lot of flies. And if we have the next slide, please. So, you know, if I'm asked, as I sometimes am, you know, what are the very best plants to encourage in a hedgerow margin? I would say hogweed and thistles. They're just such good sources of nectar and pollen for so many species. Research done on a large farm in Somerset found that these flowers are actually keystone species in ecological webs. Without them, the webs are much less intact and the species diversity is reduced. So please, where you have hogweed and thistles, do please value them. They're too often thought as weed species and removed. And I'm sure none of you have made this mistake, but please don't confuse giant hogweed, which is a non-native and toxic species, with our native hogweed, which is, as I said, a highly desirable plant. And the next slide. And then autumn, you know, we're in at the moment. I need to say very little more really than just say ivy. Great plant for late season nectar and pollen, and of course for late winter berries as well. So please don't remove it. You know, it's quite distressing sometimes to see ivy stems cut on hedgerow trees, for example, for no real purpose. I mean, the ivy isn't damaging, or very rarely is actually damaging the hedgerow tree, but it is so good for wildlife. I'm now going to move on to some ways in which hedges are very useful to farmers. And if I can have the next slide. So this is about pest control. The top photograph you see here, you see the green larva there. That's a hoverfly larva. In my vegetable patch, I usually each summer, more by laziness than design, let some of the brassicas go to flower. And they attract large numbers of aphids, and they in turn attract the hoverflies. And you can find these larvae in amongst the aphids and watch them feeding, and they are voracious. You know, they grab an aphid, suck the juices out of it, and then in what seems just a few seconds move on to the next aphid. And you can see how effective hoverflies can be at actually controlling aphid populations. So the role hedges play here is that they are the places where these predators of crop pests, whether they be spiders or carabid beetles or ladybirds or hoverflies or whatever else, is the places where they can spend the winter safely, and then in the early season they can build up their populations before these predators move out into the crop to eat the pests. And the research here shows that they can significantly reduce pest populations, things like aphids, over a distance of at least 60 meters. On an organic farm, of course, that's really important, but even on a non-organic farm, it does mean that the farmers have to apply less pesticide to control these pests. So a definite economic advantage there. And the next slide. Some really interesting research carried out by Oxford University, looking into bovine TB and transmission between badgers and cattle. Of course, a very vexed subject, and I don't intend to go into any details at the moment. But what they found is that, all else being equal, landscapes, farm landscapes with a high density of hedges, the transmission rates are reduced. So the incidence of TB breakdowns in cattle herds is reduced, and significantly so. So this is a definite advantage in farm landscapes to retain your hedges and therefore reduce your chances of having bovine TB. And now the next slide, I'd just like to mention some of the main ways in which hedges can be of real benefit to wider society. So apart from the land managers and farmers, how they benefit large family, society as a whole. I'm going to talk first of all about there being a natural solution to flooding. A lot of interest in hedges from this point of view. And here we see a hedge. This is actually a Devon hedge. So a Devon hedge always has an earth bank. But a hedge nevertheless. It will be planted up with trees and shrubs in due course. But this is one being built across the contours, along the contours of a quite steep field, with funding from the Environment Agency, specifically to reduce the rate at which stormwater runs off the field into the small stream below, and so reducing the risk of flash flooding of the settlement further downstream. This bank is not a dam. It's not designed to sort of create a permanent pond or anything like that. What it's designed to do is to reduce the rate at which water flows off the field, and so prevent these surges and stormwater. Now, I meant to put a red arrow on this slide, but I forgot. But if those of you who sharp eyes, maybe just see that there is a drain in the bottom right-hand corner of the photograph. So that's a pipe drain. Yes, thank you for the cursor pointing that out. But that allows the water to escape. It just will move more slowly than if the bank hadn't been there at all. And of course, that hedge is a bank, but hedges, even without banks, operate in this fashion too. And not only do they sort of act as a physical barrier, but they also help to the infiltration of water into the soil, so that much of it moves down into the ground rather than moving off. So that's flood risk. The next slide, please, is about soil conservation. Now, this I find a truly remarkable slide. It shows a young maize crop and a bit of netting stretched across the field down slope. And this was after just one storm event, and demonstrates just how much soil is running off this field. Now, that netting, of course, could be a hedge. So hedges are forming exactly the same function. And over a short period of time, but certainly over decades and even more over centuries, hedges are serving to prevent losses of huge amounts of soil from our land into our watercourses and out to sea. Next slide, please. And once you get your eye for it, you find that contouring hedges often show this. They form terraces. So basically, what happens is that the ground fills up behind the hedge, upslope of the hedge, and then you have the original ground level downslope of the hedge. All that soil upslope is being captured by the hedge and saved. And I know places where the farmers actually deliberately go along then and dig out that soil that's been captured and move it back up to the top of the slope, because it's so important, of course, that they should look after their soils from the point of view of crop yields. And again, next slide, please. On a similar theme to flood prevention and soil conservation, hedges alongside contours and alongside watercourses can be very effective at removing pollutants such as nitrogen and phosphates from runoff, and also can reduce a considerable amount of herbicides. So at the moment, there's a lot of work going on in river catchments across the country, actually putting in new hedges to serve exactly this function, to try and get our rivers back into a healthy condition. And the next slide, please. It's not just water that hedges are good at cleaning, but also air. And this refers particularly to our towns and cities, where if you have a hedge between the road and the pavement, Hedges will prevent a lot of pollutants, in particular these fine particulates, which are so damaging to our lungs, from reaching us. A lot of interest in that at the moment, but it does mean that hedges need to be put in different situations, as currently typically the case. So this photograph here shows the hedge really in the wrong place. It should be between the road and the pavement, not between the pavement and the garden or whatever is on the other side. Is the role that hedges can play in cleaning air is not just restricted to towns, or the use is greatest there, but also on intensive livestock farms, where ammonia production is a real problem. Then tall hedges around those units can reduce ammonia pollution, that ammonia being damaging to a large amount of biodiversity, but in particular to lichens. Now I want to come on to carbon storage with the next slide, please. So here I mentioned, you all know about COP26 and all that sort of stuff at the moment, and how we need to plant more trees, and how we need not just to reduce our emissions, but how we need to remove more and more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the air. Well, hedges are part of the solution for that. I think it's pretty self-evident that hedges will take out more carbon from the air and store more carbon than will intensive arable land or grassland. I would just point out, though, that carbon is stored not just, of course, in above ground woody growth, but also below ground in the root systems and in the soil. Particularly important, the soil carbon, because that remains locked up for a very long time indeed and is taken out of the system. That's where we really want to see it. So the next slide, we can, research shows that on a well-hedged farm, as much as 38% of all soil organic carbon can actually be located in the hedges or associated with the hedges. It's been found remarkably that soil organic carbon actually increases for up to 60 meters away from hedges. That's largely a result of the leaves from hedges actually spreading a considerable distance, but other factors that play there as well. So hedges really are part of the solution to sucking carbon out of the air. And if I have the next slide, please. The Climate Change Committee recognized that in their net zero report and have called for a 40% increase in the extent of hedges by the year 2050. It's important there, and that target has been reflected by the CPRE in their recent hedge fund report. But I would just draw your attention to the word there. It doesn't say increase the length by 40%, it increased this extent by 40%. And if we come on to the next slide, I think that really means that the way, it's not, as I say, not just increasing the length of hedges, but also it's letting hedges get wider is a simple solution to this, helping to achieve this target. From a farmer point of view, it's a quick win, letting your hedges go wider. It can be done with very little loss or extra activity. And it's in recognition of that the NFU, who have a more ambitious target of agriculture being net zero by 2040, that they are actually actively promoting hedges as having a real role to play in that. Say an easy win for farmers. And I think we'll hear a lot more in terms of agroforestry, and hedges are part of agroforestry in this context. And of course, in terms of the importance of retaining mature hedgerow trees and encouraging new ones. Next slide. I mentioned, in the past that hedges used to be highly valued for wood fuel. Indeed, down here in Devon, our bread ovens were heated very largely from faggots, that's bundles of sticks taken from hedgerows. But that's a past practice now. But you can manage hedgerows really cost effectively to produce a wood fuel crop. And they're doing that actively on the other side of the channel, particularly in northwestern France, but also right the way across to Germany and Denmark. And it's something we started to do here, but could do a lot more of. And the real advantage of doing this is that it demonstrates to farmers that hedges have a real value. I've already talked about, the value of hedges to farmers in terms of things like soil conservation and pollination and pest control, but they're all quite difficult to put pound signs against. Whereas if you actually manage your hedge to produce a wood fuel crop, then you can say exactly how much you're saving on your heating bills, or if you're selling the material off farm, how much money you're getting for that. So currently, many farmers, I'd probably say most farmers, think about hedges as just a cost to their farm. They have to spend hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds every year trimming them to keep them neat and tidy. But if on the other hand, they suddenly start a crop from them, like wood fuel, then they become valued, and there's better reason to look after them and keep them in healthy condition. Next slide. And just to point out here that you can either produce wood chips or logs from hedges. If you're producing a wood chip crop, then it's the more efficient of the two systems. It can be done entirely using equipment such as tree shears from an excavator cab or a tractor cab. No need to manual handle anything at all. And you can use the whole tree right the way from the trunk through to the finest branches for energy. Whereas if you're producing logs, as I do on our farm, then it's a much more labor-intensive business and less efficient, but still worthwhile and keeps you fit in the process. And now moving on here to just another value of hedges to farmers, shelter and shade. As we come into an increasingly chaotic climate, then increasingly hedges are going to be valued for this reason. In terms of livestock, we know, that spring lambs shelter under hedges, nothing new there, but perhaps less widely recognized is the way that cattle, they're able to withstand very cold and temperatures remarkably well, but they do suffer from heat stress. You'll all be familiar with cattle seeking the shade of a hedgerow tree in the summer. And that, the research shows, can be really important in terms of productivity as well as welfare. So reducing heat stress by providing shade increases growth rates, milk yield, disease resistance, and fertility. And increasingly, I do believe that hedgerow trees and hedgerows are going to be valued for that reason. And moving, next slide, please. In terms of crops too, the windier it gets, the more shelter we need for our crops. And what are hedges, if not shelter belts? Or perhaps I share the other way around. What are shelter belts, if not hedges? There's no real difference between the two, is there? And a shelter belt or hedge can reduce significantly the wind speed over the adjacent fields by as much as 12 times the height of the hedge. That's 8 times downwind and 4 times upwind. And if you do reduce the wind speed, then you reduce the rate of water loss from the crop, as well as reducing the physical activity of the wind that may cause, for example, cereal crops to lodge, that's to lie down. And particularly in exposed places and where the soils are well drained, the yield increases as a result of having tall hedges or shelter belts can be significant. So for broadleaf crops in particular, such as vegetables, there can be a 75% increase in yield, which is why, of course, over many parts of Europe and some parts of this country, hedges as shelter belts are highly valued. Moving on, in my journey through all the wonderful ways in which hedgerows are useful to us, they do define, don't they, our landscapes. This is a photograph of New Zealand. And to me, I don't much care for that. It's a raw landscape which has been stripped off its trees. There are only wire fences, no hedges, and it's pretty uninteresting, and from a biodiversity, pretty helpless. But that's what so much of our English landscapes could look like and would look like if we didn't have our hedges. So as it's vital, for our landscapes and for increasing their attractiveness, when farmers are selling their farm produce, they often deliberately show photographs of well-hedged landscapes because the public likes that. And if they're selling their farm, and so many farms are now bought up by people moving out of the towns and cities, the presence of good hedgerow networks is likely to increase the farm value. Next slide. And, these days, farmers are facing a lot of economic problems. And this applies not just to livestock farmers, but arable farmers as well. I mean, last year, the average income for arable farms before any subsidies or environmental payments, the average profit based only on the cereal crops of arable farms was just £100 per farm. So basically, arable farms are making no money at the moment. And most livestock farms are making no money. They're dependent upon the basic farm payment, this public subsidy for farming, which is paid on an area basis. They're dependent upon any agri-environment schemes like environmental stewardship or countryside stewardship, and they're dependent upon diversification, including attracting tourists or others to stay on their farms, bed and breakfast, for example. And here hedges can be really important in making your farm attractive and so generating some income for the farm. Next slide. Now, I'm at risk here of treading on Nigel Adams' territory. He's going to be giving you a talk on hedge management and hedge management cycle shortly. And I know that'll be a very good talk, so I've heard him talk frequently. And he will tell you all about hedge laying and indeed about hedge management. But I'm just going to mention here that hedges, have this very important cultural and heritage value. Each part of the country has its own hedge laying style. In Oxfordshire, I think Nigel will tell you it's the Midlands bullock style, as you see here. And a great many of our hedges are ancient. Something like 2/3 of our hedges probably across England are actually of medieval origin. And if you look at a landscape, you can tell an awful lot about its history from its hedgerow networks. As we can see from the next slide, this, those of you who know Oliver Rackham, the great countryside historian's work, will know that he divided up lowland Britain into two basic sorts of countryside, ancient countryside and planned countryside. Well, this is the ancient countryside where you have these irregular small fields scattered over the place. And these are the landscapes that stretch back to medieval times. So about 2/3 of lowland England is actually ancient countryside. Whereas if we come on to the next slide, this shows a planned landscape. So this is an Enclosure Act landscape created probably between about 1750 and 1850, which is the main period of the Enclosure Acts. I actually took this from Google Earth, shows an area around Newmarket in Cambridgeshire. You can see very different field patterns. But people tend to think about hedges as being rather, well, there's this myth, isn't it, that most hedgerows are recent. That isn't the case. In fact, most of our hedgerows are much older than the Enclosure Acts. So they're much older than 1750. And I know that a lot of Oxfordshire is ancient countryside. And so you have this tremendous cultural, historic heritage there that we should be looking after. And then just approaching the end of my talk now, the next slide is just talking about the value the hedges can have in terms of our own health and well-being. We all know that getting out into nature is good for us, but hedges also provide, real physical opportunities for us to improve our health, our fitness, both physical and mental, and also to engage with others socially in our community. This photograph was actually taken at a hedge competition in the Netherlands, where they are actually working in small teams, which is rather nice, having great fun doing it. The hedge laying there is a little bizarre from a British perspective, in that they're sort of laying many of the stems at waist height. But it served their purpose there because it's being done in a floodplain. And they wanted hedges that, when the floodwaters moved through rapidly, wouldn't get knocked over, would survive the onslaught. So just to conclude my talk with the next slide, please. I hope I've been able to convince you, if you weren't already convinced, how wonderful hedges are, and that they bring, multiple benefits to us, whether, we're farmers, land managers, or people living in local communities or towns everywhere. So they're absolutely vital for wildlife. They can sustain or increase farm yields. That's the pollination, pest control, soil conservation, reduce flood risk, downstream settlements. They can clean our air, they can clean our water. They can really play a useful part in addressing or helping to reduce the rate of climate change through capturing and storing carbon. And of course, they create healthy, historic, beautiful landscapes. So my final slide, and I'm looking forward enormously to hearing your questions. Just thank you very much for listening, and to remind you, as if I need to, that England has the very best hedges in the whole world. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Rob. That was fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. And you're getting lots of rounds of applause from various members that are watching as well, which is lovely. I will say that everybody, you may turn on your cameras now if you want to. You don't have to. Okay, so we have had a lot of questions coming in. We've got, to start with, there's been a huge discussion going on about hedgerow plant species. So I'll dive into that, but first I want to ask, what's your favourite thing that you found in a hedge? Do you have one?
Oh, my favourite thing, well, I'm just so fond of dormice. So in the autumn, I just spend ages wandering along our hedgerows on the farm, looking for dormouse nests, seeing where they are and just hoping maybe for the glimpse of a dormouse. I mean, they're so cute, aren't they? Nobody
Yes,
can help
they are
but like a
gorgeous.
dormouse.
Yes, no, completely agreed. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so with the hedge species discussion, firstly, you've been asked if there are any hedgerow species that are actually unwelcome, that people think are good for hedges, but in fact aren't. They've said that they're aware that some species are taken out and are removed, possibly elders, they're not sure. Is that a wildlife issue or is that a hedge laying issue, do you think?
Yes, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, there are some things that are very unwelcome. The fungus that causes ash dieback disease is really unwelcome. Many of our hedges, particularly in arable landscapes, the bottom and goose grass sometimes by docks, and that's because the high levels of artificial nutrient input. And so, we don't want that dominance. In terms of elder, I know that's a difficult one, isn't it? I think we need to be much more tolerant of elder. I mean, it is again a sign often of heavy, high levels of nutrient enrichment, particularly of nitrogen, and you do sometimes get almost pure elder hedges. And it does tend to form gaps in hedges because it produces toxins through the roots, which kills shrubs around it. But on the other hand, it's really good for wildlife. It's surprising how often you'll find birds' nests in it early in the season, chaffinch nests and those little mossy crooks, for example. The flowers are really good for insects and the berries really good for birds. So I think we need to tolerate it as part of our natural flora and only seek to control it where it really is a real problem.
Yeah, that's fair. We've had somebody mentioning blackthorn actually saying that they've encountered resistance from parish councils because it's considered harmful.
Well, and some farmers don't like it because it suckers freely and spreads out from the hedge. My answer to that is, well, if it's a problem, just cut it back. Most farmers have machinery which cut it back in a flash. Some farmers in livestock areas don't like it because they believe that as with brambles, the sheep can get hung up in it. And that can be an issue, but it's not, in my experience, a particularly big one. It's also not very nice when you're hedge laying because the thorns are kind of toxic and there have been, it's not very nice having a blackthorn inside you. It can be quite painful and it can be nice swellings, nasty swellings. But it is a superb species for wildlife. And I think we should nearly always encourage it. I mean, in my views, I didn't talk about this at all, but a hedgerow which has a wavy margin of blackthorn suckers and bramble and wild roses, well, that's the best hedgerow of all, So I think blackthorn, a native species, very good for wildlife. It's an excellent thing to plant in new hedges. I'm all for it.
Perfect. That actually links to a question I got asked even before the talk to see which hedgerow species were possibly the best, and so you've just answered that, which is fab. Also had let me see, somebody has warned against old man's beard, saying that it's not a welcome plant species that is rapidly smothering out most of the hedgerows in their area and is banned in some countries. They're feeling that not enough people are talking about this as a problem and they're trying to involve their local MP. What do you think of that, basically?
Yes, I've heard this and I've seen it on occasion as well. It is, of course, a native species, and it can at times smother hedgerows. Difficult to control, though. And again, we have to, think about where the balance of interest lies, really. A hedge that is smothered in clematis is still a good hedge for wildlife. It's still a lot better than an open field, say. And so I think sometimes, because it is difficult to control, we may just have to tolerate it and accept it. Just some of our hedges are going to be smothered in Traveller's Joy, and that's it.
Yeah, linking to that, someone said that they actually encourage other clematis since it's one of the main plants used by the hazel dormouse for nest building. So there you go. Clematis is important. And linking to that, I've just had a question of what do you think is the best hedgerow mix to encourage dormice into an area?
Well, I think when we're planting any new hedges now, we should try for a wide variety of native species. We're fortunate in that we've got a good selection of native species with no need to bring in exotics. I would say really a wide range of species is what I would go for. Good for various reasons. It's not just good for dormice, but in terms of ensuring that the hedge is going to exist into the future, what with climate change and all these new pests and diseases into the country, hedges that are really species rich are likely more resilient in the future. Of all the plants that are really good for dormice, I would pick out, first of all, bramble, fantastic. Secondly, probably blackthorn. And then there's a number of other plants behind that, things like hawthorn. It is the hazel dormouse, but in my view, and others may differ, hazel isn't actually the most important species for dormice, because the structure of hazel tends to be rather open, and in my experience, it's quite rare to find them nesting in hazel. It actually doesn't give them the cover they need. And although it's fairly good for invertebrates, and dormice, of course, eat a lot of invertebrates, particularly in the summer, caterpillars and so forth, it's not so good in terms of, sorry, I lost my track here a little bit. Just thinking, yeah, in terms of nuts, it's not so good really, because the dormouse doesn't depend upon the nuts to build up its fat reserves for hibernation, because when the nuts are produced in August and they're really good and they're green and easily edible, I mean, that's long before dormice actually need to be fattening up for hibernation. And in any case, in my experience, the grey squirrels nearly get all the nuts anyhow. So planting hazel for dormice may be not very useful, but it should certainly be included in the mix.
Yes, fair. To go sort of with the perfect hedgerow mix, somebody has just asked, you did mention some species, I noticed the hogweeds and the thistles, but someone has said, what are considered good margin wildflower species?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I would just say whatever is typical of your locality, wild native plants that you find growing alongside your hedges, which are well suited to the soils, the pH and the drainage and so forth, and are obviously being frequented by bees and butterflies and so forth, then those are the ones you should plant. Judy Webb, who some of you may know, who is closely associated, lives in Oxford, and is closely associated with the Dipteris Forum and with various naturalist societies in the area. Well, she's produced some very useful guidance to herbs that are most useful to be planted or encouraged from the point of view of insects. And I could certainly provide you to links to that at a later date if you wish.
That would be good. If you send it to me, I can chuck it I can put it in the chat, or if you want, we can send it around to everybody at another point. Yeah, either works. Perfect. Somebody's asked, what were the dimensions of the hedgerow that you sampled, the first one you got challenged to, shall we say? What what were the what's the length and width of that one that was on your farm?
Well, it was 90 meters long, and it was, I suppose, across the base of the shrubby line, about 2 meters, no, maybe 3 meters wide. And at the time I was sampling those 2 years, it was probably 3 to 4 meters high. So not exceptional in those dimensions at all. Of course, I've taken it through, and this is what Nigel will tell you all about, I take it through a management cycle. So I have laid that hedge now. We've been on the farm here for 30 years. I have laid it twice. And the idea is after each time you rejuvenate it by laying, you let it grow up a little gradually, trimming it every 2 or 3 years, keeping it bushy until inevitably it starts to get leggy and gappy. And then you lay it again. I would expect the species complement to remain much the same throughout the management cycle, except for when it is recently laid or coppiced. So for a year or two after that, you're going to find less things in it. But provided you have other hedges nearby, which still remain in very good condition, that's no problem.
Fair. This is also probably one that Nigel Adams could answer, but you're here, so I will ask you. Somebody has asked, is there an ideal width for a new hedge?
Yes, the answer is the wider the better. You know, we tend to have this standard prescription, don't we, that a hedge is a double row of whips, that's the saplings planted, you know, maybe 2 foot apart, and each sapling planted a foot apart. But really that was all designed for hawthorn hedges used to create rapid stock-proof barriers, or maybe as horse jumps for the hunt. Now, because we've got other purposes, in particular biodiversity and carbon storage, we can think more widely. And really, the bigger a hedge it is, the wider across the base, the better. But please do always leave room for these flower-rich and tussocky grass margins.
Perfect. That's definitely what I'm taking away from this, that you need the different layers of it. Brilliant. Oh, I've just had one coming in. Okay, so there's one here asking about different styles of laying and advantages, disadvantages. If it's okay, I might leave that one for the Nigel Adams talk, because that is a very specific hedge laying and management question. In the meantime, I've had people inspired by your insect IDing and collecting. So I've got somebody who's insect recording. The Global Malaise Trap Project is doing barcoding of insects if anyone is interested in assessing the contents of their hedge, to which I have had someone reply that they've got a small holding with a hedge, that they'd be happy to get involved. So I would like to encourage anybody that if they do want their hedge survey to get in touch with the Global Malaise Trap Project, so that they can do that for you. Lastly, we've got some people that were advocating just sort of reimbursing what you've already said, Rob, about the value of ivy and elder for wildlife. And we've had somebody saying, please, could you expand on the ivy subject and just clarify that it really does not damage trees? So they're obviously being frustrated that it's getting cut down.
Yes, I mean, just step back a little bit. I mean, I'd love people to do more studies looking at the biodiversity complement of hedges. So yes, please, to those malaise trap and bark coding studies. In terms of ivy, it's not parasitic. It's only using the tree as a support. And really, the only way it can damage a tree is if it acts as a huge sort of sail up in the canopy and makes it more likely that a tree blows over. But other than that, yeah, they're just so good, you know, roosting tawny owls, birds, berries, late season nectar. I mean, what's not to like about ivy?
Perfect. So our final question is, would you suggest alongside hedge laying, seeding wildflowers as well as?
Yes, I would. I definitely would. I mean, it's something that we don't know much about. I mean, we know about how to create cereal field margins, wild bird mixes, pollen mixes. We know how to do that. And that's done by, full cultivation methods. It's as complicated as growing the crop itself. We know how to do that. But actually creating sort of permanent tussocky grass or herb-rich margins alongside hedges, well, we understand that less well. We need a lot more research and practical experience of that. Basically, often, if you haven't got too much nutrient enrichment, then natural processes in nature will do that by itself. But I have seen hedges which have successfully been where the floristic diversity has been boosted by putting in plugs, small plants actually putting into the hedge, and that seems to be a good idea. But critically, in livestock situations, what is really important is getting the grazing management right, because you don't want to fence off these margins if you can avoid it. As soon as you get a fence, it becomes impossible often to manage behind the fence, and you get just rank grasses and bramble growing. Now, I'm all in favor of rank grasses and bramble, but that's not good if you want to get herb-rich margins. So fences are not a very good idea. And likewise, high levels of stocking, particularly winter grazing by sheep, are definitely a no-no. It's why, often the only good herb-rich margins we find around for our hedges are those alongside our lanes, our roads, because inside the field systems, either there's cultivation right up to the edge of the hedge, or there is intensive livestock grazing right up to the edge of the shrubby part of the hedge. And the result is you get no flowers. So it's a complicated business, and I wish I had all the answers.
Don't we all? Yeah. Okay, fair. Well, hopefully after with the series, hopefully people have a clearer picture of what's good and what'll help wildlife. I think you've definitely been inspiring. I don't know if you're seeing the chat, but the amount of thank yous and brilliant talks and various compliments that you're getting, it's there's a lot of them. I like this one, which I will read to you, from Anne, saying, thank you, Rob, most interesting and informative. Will definitely respect ivy plenty in Ireland. So yeah, I think that's the end of the questions. It's now all thank yous. So